there has been an increasing politicisation of the Muslim identity in Britain. I think Islamism is a poison. It's a poison in Britain, it's a poison in the Middle East. So this incident this week is just one of actually quite a large number of incidents, but they haven't been talked about. I think if somebody looked at the data properly, this is as scandalous as the grooming gangs situation.
How did your friends and family in Oldham and in the northwest feel about Brexit?
Why do you ask, Michael?
The reason I ask is this. Hello and welcome to Quite Right. This week, Maddie is away and I'll be talking to Munira Mirza. Munira has been at the heart of some of the most consequential decisions in British politics. A graduate of Oxford University, having been brought up in Oldham, Munira worked at Policy Exchange, a think tank which I helped set up. And Munira was central there to the debate on what made a successful multi-ethnic, multicultural society. She then graduated to work for Boris Johnson when Boris was Mayor of London, and Munira was Deputy Mayor in charge of arts, education and culture. Munira then went on to work for Boris in No.10 as head of the Policy Unit. She was the author and architect of the 2019 election manifesto, which secured a landslide victory for the Conservatives, and she was there at the heart of the Boris Johnson government until resigning before Boris himself stood down. Munira has seen the system from the inside, knows what's gone wrong, and is determined to fix it. In our two-part discussion, we'll be discussing, first of all, some of the issues around multiculturalism, which Munira first began to study more than 20 years ago. Questions of racism, discrimination, Islamism, the extent to which Britain, particularly as we contemplate the results of the Gorton and Denton by-election, is a country divided. What can be done about it? How can we resolve that? And in the second part of our discussion, we'll be discussing leadership. How can it be provided? Where does it come from? What are the lessons of Boris's premiership? What are the failures of Starmer's premiership from which we can draw appropriate pointers to the future? And how can you actually, as Munira is dedicated to doing, fix Britain? Munira, welcome to Quite Right.
Thank you.
You grew up in the northwest, in Oldham, and obviously the political eyes of the country are trained on the northwest at the moment because of the Gorton and Denton by-election. As someone who started their political journey broadly on the left, as someone who's worked for governments seeking to ensure that alienated working-class voters could feel that they had a patriotic government that was on their side, what lessons do you draw?
Well, it's an area I know a little bit because my family have some connections to a mosque in the area. So I know that strip, the Stockport Road, quite well. And it is a very diverse area. I think it's fair to say it feels quite run down in some parts of it. So a lot of the general dissatisfaction with government, particularly in the last year or two, I think are quite stark in that constituency. I mean, all by-elections are really a message to the incumbent government. And I think it will be a huge amount of anger and frustration about the current government, the disappointment from a lot of people. As you say, reform, polling, at least in some polls, are ahead. The complication is that there is a very large Muslim vote in that area. It's I think about a third of the voters are Muslim. And therefore, the Greens are very active. They're campaigning in mosques. They're obviously campaigning on the issue of Gaza, which has detached the Muslim vote from Labour quite significantly. So even though this is a very strong, traditionally a strong Labour seat, the Greens are very likely to be able to mobilise a high turnout from that group. So, I mean, what are the lessons? Well, Labour are under serious threat and they have lost, to some extent, quite a large part of their voting base in that area, potentially to the Greens. The thing that we can't predict, I mean, I'm not an expert in judging from the polls, but whether Labour can mobilise sufficiently the anti-reform vote. Has this been happened elsewhere? And even though Labour are saying, well, reform are ahead, doing very well, we need to get the vote out. We're the only party that can beat reform. That's their main sales pitch to the voters. It's not a very inspiring one. No. It's not really about what have Labour achieved, what do they want to do. It's more, let's stop these guys from winning.
British Muslim voters traditionally were one of the constituencies upon which Labour could most rely. Why do you think there's been a rupture between British Muslim voters and Labour?
Oh, well, the straightforward answer is the recent events in Gaza. But I think it's been happening for quite a long time. Actually, if you look at the constituency I grew up in, Oldham, there has been quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the local council. There's a lot of sort of internecine fighting as well in that area. And a sense that Labour have probably taken that group for granted. They have been, and the Conservatives have also done this to some extent in some constituencies, and not just a Labour phenomenon, but the tendency to go to the leaders of the local religious communities, to curry favour, to try and build a voting base through them. That has worked for quite a long time, but it's started to fray now. And once people switch their vote, it's a bit like having an affair. Once you've done it once, it's easier to keep doing it. And that has started to happen, that people have realised that they don't have to vote Labour in order to influence what's going on. And the Greens are going to capitalise on that. The independents that were elected in the 24 election have also shown that there is an alternative to Labour. So I think that sense of both being taken for granted, things are getting worse. I mean, actually, lots of Muslims are just motivated by the same things as everyone else. Cost of living, the energy bills are going up, the cost of butter is going up. They're really frustrated that the area looks run down. They're also frustrated about the rise in immigration and illegal immigration, which affects them because they live in poorer areas where that has a bigger impact. So all of those issues, Gaza is probably the lightning rod, or the thing that sparked that detachment. But it was the currents have been there for a while.
Why is Gaza the polarising and energising issue that it is? If I were living in Manchester, I might be worried about public transport. I might be worried about inflation. I might be worried about poor housing. Why should I worry, other than in a general humanitarian sense, about what's happening in Gaza?
For Muslims,
yes,
in particular, I mean, Muslims and parts of the left.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, why has Israel and the Palestine issue been a significant concern for the left and for Muslims for decades? It is just one of those facts. It is felt very, very deeply by a lot of people. It's also been, to some extent, mobilised by people like George Galloway, who have used it as a way of saying, Muslims are being oppressed around the world. And therefore, if you are a devout and serious Muslim, if you care about your wider community, then you will vote in any way that will influence foreign policy in the UK. I think that has been quite a kind of well-established tendency.
And do you think part of it is an attempt by some to say that people's Muslim identity, and therefore their solidarity with brothers and sisters who are suffering in Gaza, is more important than their British or Manchester identity and their concern about interest rates and bus routes?
I think that is part of that is the tactic that's being used, particularly by people like Galloway and some of the independent MPs. I don't know if that's sufficient in itself. I think if you had broadly a dynamic economy, lots of jobs being created, the bus routes were working, then maybe that wouldn't have such a galvanising effect. But it's the fact that everything else is going so badly wrong. They're fed up with Labour anyway. And this issue evokes a great deal of emotion. Is it the case that Muslims in this country are more preoccupied with their religious identity? I mean, we don't have enough real in-depth research to be able to judge that. But it does matter more. Religious identity does matter more to Muslims than perhaps other religious groups. And it is more politicised than for other religious groups.
Within that, one of the concerns that I've had is that the government and organs of the state, whether that's the police or local authorities, have a very, very poor understanding of the different traditions, values, ideologies within British Muslim communities. So there's a tendency to say Muslim, but not to think about different religious traditions, whether that's Barelwi or Deobandi, not to think about parts of, for example, the subcontinent that individual families might be able to trace their grandparents back to. There's a difference between someone whose grandparents might have come from Kashmir and someone whose grandparents might have come from a different part of Pakistan or indeed from India. Do you think there is that lack of knowledge there? Does it matter?
So I started writing about radicalisation of Muslims about 20 years ago. For Policy Exchange, I wrote a report which argued that there has been an increasing politicisation of the Muslim identity in Britain. And bizarrely, that the more extreme ideas were more popular amongst younger people than older people. So this was a kind of modern phenomenon.
People who've been brought up and educated in England.
And their parents tended to be more small c conservative and kind of be more preoccupied by, the old-fashioned kind of communal politics and, national identity. But the younger generation was more preoccupied by religious identity and Islamism. Still minority view, Islamism, the political form of Islam, more extreme form. A lot of that was motivated and provoked by, the World Trade bombings and the subsequent wars. But that was becoming a phenomenon 20 years ago. I think it's now much more widespread. I think it is a serious issue. I think Islamism is a poison. It's a poison in Britain. It's a poison in the Middle East and many other countries. It is also vying against more moderate forms of Islam. And I think to answer your question, the authorities in this country, local authorities, the police, are very easily captured by a particular part of that Muslim community, which is at the more extreme Islamist end. So that's not to say that everyone the police talks to in a local community setting has extreme ideas. Many of them are just, kind of moderate, normal people with, concerns about, local issues that affect them. Without wanting to sound conspiratorial about it, there are groups that are just simply trying to use their influence with the police, as we've seen recently in the case of Birmingham, to try and get results that they want, that benefit them, and to dominate how Muslim communities think and talk about certain issues. So, the Maccabi Tel Aviv case is, absolutely has just exposed how this works.
And obviously there's a sort of tactical, operational weakness on the part of the police or local authorities in taking extremist advocates as proxies for the whole of the British Muslim community or communities. But there's also a deeper question, perhaps, which is, why is it that for many younger British Muslims, Islam is a more important part of their identity and Islamism is an appealing ideology? If there's a failure that can be laid at the door of British institutions in allowing that to happen, where does that failure lie?
Oh, I think there are many different organisations that are probably responsible. I mean, so there's a bigger phenomenon, which is the geopolitical phenomenon, which is Islamism has been growing around the world. There are organisations in other countries that have been deliberately trying to stoke tensions. The Muslim Brotherhood have proxies in Britain and elsewhere that are trying to turn the Muslim versus the West story into a dominant narrative, and they've been quite successful. They have therefore then been abetted by slightly naive organisations like the police, who have these sort of community liaison type relationships with local leaders and various groups, not doing proper due diligence, not checking what these people have said online, believing a bit naively that their intentions are to, build community cohesion and so on. And it's their naivety that has allowed lots of these people to come into, these sort of local government meetings and parade to the rest of the community how significant and influential they are. And therefore they've developed quite a cosy relationship in a lot of places. It's definitely the case with local authorities that and some of this is well-intentioned, they want to engage with ethnic groups in their area, ethnic populations that are perhaps a little bit more removed from the democratic process. And understandably, in the 90s, 2000s, there was an effort to sort of reach out to them. And these so-called community leaders come forward and say, well, we can give you access. You can come and speak at our mosque. You can come and speak at our community centre. The problem is that the more that authorities try and talk to Muslims through these intermediaries, and the more they emphasize the difference that the different kind of distinct concerns and interests of Muslim people, the more they stoke that sense of Muslims are separate to everyone else. And that, I think, is a process that has now led to all these ill effects.
When you were working for the Mayor of London, you had responsibility for arts, culture, education. Obviously, quite a lot of the levers in those areas were in the hands of national government, or in some cases, the local authorities or individual schools. Were you able to, during that time, develop policies to tackle both that sense that some people consider themselves communities apart and the unwillingness of some institutions to think about how to deal with multiculturalism and separatism?
So I remember one of the first decisions we took when Boris became mayor was to cancel a festival called the Rise Festival, which Ken Livingstone and his advisor, Lee Jasper, who I don't know how many of your listeners will remember Lee Jasper, who's a controversial figure.
Energetic, very jolly Marxist lieutenant of Ken Livingstone.
And had a very, and Ken himself, who in many respects actually was, I think, quite an effective man, and to give him credit, did a lot of good things for London. But his Achilles heel was this kind of pandering to identity politics. They had all sorts of events and policies which were about trying to relate to ethnic groups as distinct groups, and they were, through their funding, through their various sort of promotional events and so on, the Black community, the Muslim community, and so on. We came in, and this festival was an anti-racism festival in a park in North London. I think it might have been Victoria Park in North London. And we said, we're not going to do it as an anti-racism festival. It's going to have a much more positive spin. We're celebrating London's diverse communities and so on. Basically trying to take out of it this sense that there's a victimised, oppressed set of groups in London that are, there's a lot of kind of racism against them. Not to say that racism doesn't exist, of course it does, but to try and change the narrative and make it much more about everyone coming together. And this was a really controversial decision. I remember I'd only been in the job for about 6 weeks, and we announced that we were going to do this. And all of the people who had supported Ken during the election campaign, and Lee Jasper came out and said, this is terrible. And in the end, we changed it, and it was fine. And the world didn't fall apart, the sky didn't fall in. But it was a very, very strongly held view that the mayor, all the local authorities had to have these constant anti-racism initiatives, because if they didn't, then all these white Londoners would go back to their racist ways and would continue to oppress these minorities. I think the Overton window has moved on. I think, London's obviously much more diverse than it was even back then. And I think there's probably a more of a sophisticated argument about, identity politics now. I think people are aware now that stoking division in that way, creating a sense of grievance, telling ethnic minorities that they're victims of white people in some way. In some ways, that conversation has become more nuanced and sophisticated than it was. Some ways it's got worse. But yeah, I mean, did we change how people thought about these issues? I think we try to use the bully pulpit a bit. I regret not being able to do more, but we, in the mayor's office, you have limited powers to be able to influence what's being taught in schools or how cultural organisations talk about these issues. I wrote quite a lot and I spoke at things. But, ultimately, these are cultural trends.
Yes.
And what I think politicians can do is use the bully pulpit. I think they can make the argument for why, this kind of culture of grievance and victimhood will damage our society. But it's very hard to introduce a piece of legislation or a policy that will fix that.
One area where perhaps a lack of preparation has been dealing with grooming gangs. There's also, though, another issue in the news this week, and that is the reporting on the killing in Nottingham by a mentally ill individual, Valdo Calocane. As you look at that case, and indeed as you look at the grooming gang question, is there anything that you would draw as lessons, partly from the grooming gangs issue, but also from the mental health questions that perhaps have gone unexamined with sufficient rigour?
Yeah, so the case that you're referring to, it's a very, very
in
tragic
Nottingham.
case of 3 people who were tragically murdered. And the person involved had a mental health patient. He was black. He was seen by various doctors. And it was reported in the newspapers that one of the reasons that the doctors didn't give him a community treatment order earlier was because there was a concern about the disproportionate number of black men who were being detained in the mental health system. And this is something I've written about for a long time. I've written, over the last 20 years about the fact that there's this perception that the reason that there are more black men detained proportionally in the mental health system because of institutional racism. And this is fundamentally a misreading of the data. The real expert on this is a man called Professor Swaran Singh, who's based in Warwick. He's an academic and a clinical psychiatrist. And he came to my attention, I think probably about 20 years ago, saying that the psychiatric profession has got itself into a state where it believes that this inequality, this racial inequality is their fault, that somehow there's racism in the system. And his argument is that that's not the case, that it's just genuinely the case that there is higher prevalence amongst some ethnic groups. And this is a misreading of the data.
In the same way as there's a higher incidence of diabetes amongst some ethnic groups.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a complex thing, and we could spend more time talking about it. But fundamentally, the pressure has been for the last 20 years, and the Royal College of Psychiatry has been part of this, is to try and put pressure on people in clinician roles to not detain people, even if they are higher risk. And so this incident this week is just one of actually quite a large number of incidents, but they haven't been talked about. I think if somebody looked at the data properly, this is as scandalous as the grooming gangs situation. We are effectively increasing the risk to the public because of this fear of being accused of institutional racism, which is a misreading of what's actually happening.
There's a phrase, suicidal empathy, which originally was coined in America. It's subsequently been popularized by Matt Goodman, funnily enough, the Reform candidate in Denton and Gorton. And it is a kindness towards those who are considered to be victims that actually ends up causing far more harm to those with whom you're empathizing and others. And it's arguably at work here. People who are in the grip of mental illness naturally need care and attention. Discrimination on the basis of irrational prejudice is obviously sinful, but it's no help to the individuals concerned, let alone to wider society, to have people who are in the grip of a psychosis or another mental disturbance roaming freely, and to have those people roaming freely partly because you think that there is something institutionally racist about appropriate care.
Yeah, so I think it's even worse than that. I think it's partly kindness. I'm sure for many people it's motivated by a desire to kind of, make sure that people aren't treated unfairly or, face discrimination. I think it's also a fear of being accused of being institutionally racist.
Yeah.
And that I think is much worse because people actually know why there is this disparity between ethnic groups, but they still haven't changed the way that they deal with these decisions on the ground. And I think it's a very good example of where even when people look at the evidence and the data, this is something that has been known and talked about in academic papers. I mentioned Professor Singh just now, who's written about this. I think lots of people know that the cause is not institutional racism. I think they know that we need to detain people who are at high risk, but they're still not doing it because of this political pressure. And it's an ideological pressure. And so just like the grooming gangs, where lots of people know that something is happening in relation to one particular group in a community, they're still not intervening because they're afraid of being accused of racism. So that's different to just, we want to be kind. It's not just about good intentions. It's almost a willful ignoring of the data.
You now have some Labour politicians who use the allegation of racism against people in reform. You now have campaign organisations like Hope Not Hate, born out of anti-extremism, that are energetic in identifying people whom they accuse of being racist. Obviously, irrational prejudice is a sin, but have we now reached a point where the allegation is flung around so promiscuously that it's not just the case that it may be drained of meaning, it's actually become counterproductive to go racist hunting, as it were?
So, to be clear, I think racism exists.
Yes.
I think there is prejudice against particular groups. I think it's right that we have anti-discrimination law, etc. Just to be absolutely clear, the issue of racism has been weaponized to some extent to try and has introduced a lot of bad policy, bad outcomes. And I think there are lots of people who are aware of these adverse consequences who are not doing anything about it. In the end, the groups that often suffer the most are those ethnic groups. I mean, if people who are suffering severe mental health problems, schizophrenia, are not getting treatment, and they end up committing a horrendous crime and then end up in jail, that is really not good for them either. And so I think those ethnic groups, no matter how well-intentioned these policies are the ones who suffer the worst consequences. I think your question was, is this counterproductive? Yeah, it's deeply counterproductive. And I think politicians, because they are afraid of leading and making this argument, are reinforcing this very bad trend.
Just at the time that you left the mayor's office, obviously we had the EU referendum. Which side did you back and why?
I backed leaving. I supported the Vote Leave campaign. I helped Boris prepare for the various debates. I still back leaving, as controversial as it is. I still think it's the right thing for. I still think it's, and in fact, actually, I did quite a lot of hustings in the creative industry sector, which didn't make me popular. And, that sector has been quite, has had a few negative effects, quite a few negative effects from Brexit. So, absolutely not pretending that the short-term effect of it has been great for everybody. And I always thought that it would have some short-term negative consequences because it is quite a big rupture. But I think long-term for the country, it's better to have control over our laws and our regulation. I think that's already bearing out.
Yep.
The EU has already introduced, I think, quite restrictive regulations around things like AI in a way that I don't think we should. I think we should have regulation on AI, but I think it should be a different model. And then, when I was in No.10, we made quite a few changes to regulations since leaving the EU, things around precision breeding, gene editing, clinical trials, reform, procurement. So we did start to make some changes.
All of which were, funnily enough, sort of pro-science, as it were.
Yeah.
Because, again, one of the lobbies that was most sort of critical of Brexit were people speaking for scientists, worried about loss of access to funding and so on. But it is interesting that, as you mentioned, whether it's precision breeding, gene editing, AI and so on, that the EU's approach, maybe influenced by things like the precautionary principle, has tended to be less welcoming to innovation than the approach that we've taken subsequently, perhaps tentatively, perhaps in a ineffectual manner, but definitely the divergence has all been in favour of innovation rather than anything else.
Yeah, so I think there's a sort of set of principles which guides the EU on a lot of these things. As you say, the precautionary principle, which tend to be quite cautious, as the name would imply, and also because they have a lot of countries that are trying to preserve existing vested interests, other companies that maybe don't want to be disrupted, and they have quite a lot of influence over how regulations are formed. So, just on a pure regulatory basis, I think it's better to be able to decide and determine our own regulation. Britain also has a different economic structure. We have a real strengths in science and technology, and therefore we want regulation that suits our industry and suits our economy. So on that basis, I think it was the right decision to leave. I wouldn't defend every single thing we've done since or how we've left, and I think there's room for improvement. But it's a process, not an event. It's allowed us now to have much more freedom about how we do things. And fundamentally, I think all our regulation, all our laws should be, democratically accountable. I think if the if stakeholders in this country, if vested interests or NGOs have strong views about things, they should be able to influence the regulation and the policy that comes out. And it's much harder for them to do it via the EU.
How did your friends and family in Oldham and in the Northwest feel about Brexit?
Well, mixed, I guess, like anyone else. I have lots of friends in the North I have one friend who, I remember at the time, told me I've never met anybody who voted Leave, and she lived in Manchester. So this divide, this idea that, London was all Remain, the rest of the country was all Leave, that's not true. It was a much more urban city phenomenon, maybe versus small towns and suburbs. And then I have family members who were sympathetic to Leave as well, and friends.
Because the 2019...
Why do you ask, Michael?
The reason I ask is this. So you've got a life experience with which I can identify. Some people might find that odd, in that both of us were born and brought up in provincial towns or cities. Both of us had families, please correct me if I'm wrong, who believe very strongly in the value of education. Mm-hmm. Both of us found ourselves at Oxford University at different times, me many years before you, but with our families taking a certain degree of pride, I suppose, in that educational journey. Then both of us found ourselves in politics, though doing different things. And then both of us were convinced of Leave. In my own case, my mum and dad they're not particularly political, weren't particularly political, but they were supporters of Leave. And I did feel that it was one of those moments or issues where the instincts of many people within the political world about the debate were divorced from, not in a patronizing way, though that sometimes came about, but were divorced from the feelings, the instincts of many other people in the country. And I felt that there was often insufficient curiosity and sympathy, including from some people who advocated Leave, with the sentiments of those who actually voted Leave. And this is a way of going to 2019 and the Conservative manifesto then and what followed. During the course of the Brexit debate, and particularly afterwards, there was understandable talk about deregulation, good thing, in favour. Talk about trade. But actually, one of the things that not everyone realised, but I think you did and I think Boris did, is that part of the Brexit vote was also an attempt by many people in the country to say the political managerial class that's been leading this country has become cut adrift. It is introspective, self-referential, and its values are dictated by applause from within a tight circle rather than an effort to serve the whole country. People like David Goodhart have talked about the somewhere, anywhere divide, and I think while it's a simplification, it's pretty accurate. And the 2019 manifesto and the broader levelling up drive, now levelling up derided, I actually think got to the heart of one of the reasons behind Brexit, which is that the economic model and the style of political leadership that people saw in Westminster, and even more so in Brussels, was one that wasn't serving them.
So I think, I'm not referring to people, in the North and
sure.
necessarily
I'm
that I know,
generalising,
but it's. I think the biggest driver was, of course, immigration.
Yes,
that was the thing that brought home the failure of the system, the elite, to listen to people's concerns.
Yes.
The numbers had got quite significant, or at least back then it seemed significant. But now it looks relatively small, and that was the major driver. The sense that we've been, the public have been saying for 20 years or more, we want to reduce immigration, and it keeps getting bigger. And even under Cameron, who had said we're going to reduce it to 10, under 100,000, and it kept growing. And the reason it kept growing is because of free movement from the EU and the inability of government to be able to exercise any control over that particular route. So that's why it was crystallised. That's why it came out. I don't know to what extent people, around the country were thinking, well, it's the broader, kind of malaise and the EU and the economic models failed because of our membership of the EU. I can't say for sure if it was kind of understood or felt in that way. Although I was surprised, actually, during the referendum, how knowledgeable people were about the EU. There was a lot of talk afterwards that people had been tricked into voting leave and didn't understand what they'd voted for. In my experience, and lots of people I know who campaigned during that period said, no, people were pretty clued up, actually, surprisingly so. And, obviously voter turnout was quite high. I mean, it was the highest for a long time.
Oh, quite.
People were not simply voting kind of accidentally. They were, I think, engaged in the arguments.
I mean,
you asked about the 2019 manifesto. Obviously, the points-based system was in there, saying we're going to change the immigration model was part of it. But you're right that really it was this bigger problem, which is why had we had so much immigration for that period since 2004? What had been the driver? It was partly a cultural, ideological thing to do with ideas of globalization. We want to be a country that welcomes people. But it's also because our economic model was failing. Even before 2008, there were serious problems with productivity and with investment in this country. And we had for a long time basically a model that relied on expanding the number of people in this country.
Yes.
Expanding GDP, but not GDP per capita. And I think levelling up, sometimes people are very scathing about the phrase and say, well, it's just about redistribution or, making towns and cities around the country look a bit nicer. And it was not a real thing. In my view, it was about fixing the broken economic model.
Yes.
Not broken irreparably. I think it's we have lots of strengths in this country, but we have, over the last 20 or so years, done things that have caused a lot of self-harm, which have made it harder for our best industries to expand, for productivity to increase, to create good jobs around the country. There's a real problem that there are parts of the country like the Northeast where there are more people employed by the public sector than the private sector. And that is something that the 2019 manifesto was trying to address, this deeper structural thing of how do you get the country's economy to start growing again in a way that everyone benefits.
I, perhaps unsurprisingly, completely agree. And I think that the concerns about immigration were both about immigration themselves, but also what immigration signified. So exactly as you say, it was symptomatic of an attitude which was traditional industries, brackets, in which many people have taken pride, don't really matter anymore. A sophisticated modern economy doesn't need them. What we need are a successful financial services sector, and then the ancillary workers, baristas, cleaners, people working in the health and care sector, to service that. If your community changes as a result, and I know there's a touch of what Zia Youssef has been saying this week in this, if what was the local church, brackets, you might not have gone there, but maybe your parents did, if that changes and becomes a mosque, if it is the case that the streets in which you grew up are transformed, frankly, either we don't care, we the governing elite don't care, or we actively think it is good for you to have that which was familiar change, because we're not stating it out loud, but we do think that you're racist and you need to be educated out of it.
Well, they did state it out loud.
Exactly, in some cases.
Yeah.
And for many people, it would feel entirely understandable that they would think, you're not concerned about dignified jobs in my area. You're not concerned about the pride that I take in my community. You're not concerned about that which is familiar, which gives me a sense of affection and loyalty to this place. You're principally concerned about two things. One, what is economically convenient for those who are already wealthy. And secondly, rubbing my nose in it by saying that you are more enlightened than I am and that I have to bear the consequences. And unsurprisingly, people thought, given the opportunity to say no to that, they would take it. My own hunch is that view having been taken, people's general view would be, okay, and this I think was the point of the 2019 manifesto, I hope, government, that you've got the message. We're not really going to obsess about migration. We would just like the numbers now to go down. What we really want to do is to see that you understand what has happened to our communities and to the country, of which immigration has been a significant part, and let's tackle that. And as you say, it was about changing that political economy and thinking in that way. Am I over-romanticising the views that you and others had at the time of the 2019 manifesto being written?
Yeah, that was our view, that we had an opportunity to both change use the levers of power to try and get parts of the economy growing again, deal with the fact that energy prices have gone up, that we couldn't build infrastructure, reform planning, all those things which have been holding that, industry and, parts of our economy that actually, could function quite well. It was also about, really responding to public pressure and saying, we hear you and we understand that you want to try and slow down the pace of this demographic change. Subsequent events did not bear out in that way, sadly, as you know, for reasons that we can go into. But I think after the Brexit vote happened, the reaction, and also during the referendum campaign itself, the reaction of some people in authority, some political people, characterising the desire to control immigration as racist, I think probably did just aggravate a very large part of the population. And I've spoken to quite a lot of people who changed their mind after the vote because they were so appalled by the way that, authority figures were sort of demonising the working class. Or, even frankly, parts of the middle class for saying, well, maybe we don't want free movement. Maybe that's not the right thing for this country. And so, in a way, the narrative that the Remain campaign used to try and scare people or morally blackmail people into voting their way, I think backfired. And I think a lot of people felt quite hacked off that they were being told that there was something wrong with them morally because they wanted to be able to put some controls back into the immigration system. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think, these drivers are partly political, ideological. It's to do with, how we feel about ourselves as a country, wanting to present Britain as this open, multicultural society. Therefore, we shouldn't have borders at all, versus a conception of actually we should have an immigration system that works for the people who live in this country.